few times if you'd like to respond.
Chair Matheny, you sound very muffled, so I don't know. I just wanted to let you know that. Thanks.
Thanks. Can you hear me now?
Very difficult to understand.
Okay. Miss Blake. Can you hear Miss Blake? Go ahead. I'll try and fix my microphone.
I wanted to answer Commissioner Sherwood a little bit. You had talked about the utility pole out in front of your house. I did read the proposal. I read everything that Attorney Rosenberg had sent to the commission, and um, a lot of your questions would be answered by taking a look at the findings of fact and some of the engineering reports that were contained in some of the documents that he sent. But in the proposal, one of the things that you're being asked to approve is a by right grant for the erection of new mini towers and poles in public rights of way without further review. If existing utility poles are unavailable for any number of reasons. In the review documents from Pura and the engineering reports, you'll see that very often the existing utility poles now are loaded up with equipment already and are unsuitable for additional for additional equipment. And so you asked about the utility pole in front of your house. If that's unsuitable for because of other equipment being attached to it, the proposal would allow them to erect a brand new one right in front of you. So that's something. Pay attention to the details when it comes to this proposal. If you think about it, what's being asked almost pits the city. There's constitutional issues involved with this, and the lawyers will appreciate this. It almost pits the city against the citizens it represents. Should those citizens decide to challenge these individual sites, that's part of what's going on with the proposal. It's all inadvertent, but that can be the upside of what's contained in that proposal. It's really a bit of a giveaway for very little financial gain, since the fees are like $270 for each utility pole. Most of the utilities, I assume, throughout Stamford and the rights of way are owned by EverSource. I'm not quite sure what it is that Stamford would get out of that. So it's a financial giveaway for very little gain, and potential property devaluation and very large potential liability, given the holes that have been mapped out in the safety and the regulatory channels and apparatus that have been mapped out for you tonight. So wander into the weeds, get into the weeds.
Thank you.
Actually, you're asking all of the right questions, Commissioner Sherwood, all of the right questions. Back in in the 1980s, it was 1983. Those were the Deloge studies of monkeys and rats. There was no broadband. If you think of the term broadband, a lot of frequencies in there. Back then, they were just focused on a very, very narrow range, and that was used to set what's called the specific absorption rate, which is what people are talking about here. For ambient exposures, that's a different measurement. That's not the SAR. That's a measurement of energy that moves through space. So it's a slightly different far field exposure. SARs are primarily confined to near field exposures. When it comes to a small cell antenna that would be, for instance, mounted outside of your house, you would have the equivalent of both a near and pretty much a far field exposure at the same time, in a broadband frequency that has never been adequately tested or investigated for the proper biological effects, which puts people and reviewers in the position of looking at each individual study that has ever been published, and there are thousands of them, and teasing apart which frequency was studied, what were the effects, and nobody wants to do that. We really do need we need to study broadband effects, because that's what we're being asked to live with the increasing technologies.
And might I
that for a 5G antenna to work for the foreseeable future, it will have to include within it the 4G capability. So effectively, you're taking things that have previously been delegated to rooftops or mountaintops and bringing them potentially right next to your bedroom window, where they've never been tested for use that close to humans. And certainly 5G with its multiple, it's called multiplex, it's multiple in, multiple out signals that can beam, form, and connect with devices. It's basically bringing it all closer together than
Yes.
has.
Yes. The other thing that I wanted to add is that most of the small cells come pre-equipped with 5G antenna capacities, and 4G Lite is primarily the thing that's being built out still these days. But 5G can be remotely activated at will without notification to the municipality.
Just by turning it on. Yeah.
Just by turning it on, and you'll never know. Well, not immediately anyway.
Not unless you stipulate monitoring, regular surveillance, and monitoring, which is what
Yes.
it's taking place in France and Israel. They're doing regular monitoring. Ms. Scarrato showed you a slide of how many countries, I think more than 20, that do some form of monitoring. And we're not, let me be very clear, we're not anti-technology. We're pro-health. We think health,
Yes.
we want to see health taken into account. We want to see software and hardware changes so that these technologies will work better, but more safely. That's what.
Yes, exactly.
Can you hear me now? Better? No.
Chair Matheny, we can't hear you. You sound like you're in a tunnel.
Is that any better?
Nope.
Hold on.
Sign
Is that any
language.
better?
Nope.
A bit. It was a bit better.
Better.
Try
Sorry.
again.
Yeah. Thank you. Ms. Carrano, did you want to have a statement before I move on to the next speaker? You had your hand up for a while. Sorry.
Ms. Corrado, I think you're
I
muted.
apologize. I think, yes, well, I actually was going to just go back to the animal study and say that in 1999, the Food and Drug Administration nominated the National Toxicology Program to do a study to address what's been raised here, which is how could our limits have been based on these small animal studies that were about under 60 minutes of exposure? How do we know what long-term effects could be? And the U.S. government embarked on a $30 million study on rats and mice, and they did find clear evidence of cancer in the male rats and DNA damage in both rat and mice groups. So the one study that the U.S. government did found effects from long-term chronic exposure, but because of the lack of regulatory accountability that we have, there's been no adequate looking at that study, looking at an analysis of what that means for humans, and also, of course, looking at all of these other effects. So when the limit was set in 1996, the limits were set based on the assumption that heating was the only harm because of those small animal studies that were identified. And you can just go to the IEEE, for example, their 2019, where they have a table where they actually reference these studies as being behind that effect of behavioral disruption. The rats, the small animals didn't press that lever for food. So that's what I had raised my hand about. I'm sorry. We've moved on a little bit, but I thought it was an important piece of the story.
If the board wants to hear more about this, we're happy to discuss it. But the interesting thing was that the FDA requested that study, and then they rejected the study they had requested 10 years later. It was a new FDA, claiming that animal studies were not relevant to humans. Now, this is a preposterous position for the FDA to take, since the entire foundation of pharmacology is animal studies. But it was quite a complicated rejection. And it to my way of thinking, and I believe the New Hampshire Commission concluded this as well, this was a reflection of the captured agency involved, and nothing more than that. It was exactly as Professor Chamberlain said at the end, it was the politics interfering with the science. Because this was a study the FDA requested, the FDA reviewed, the FDA evaluated at every step along the way. And then when the results came out to be highly inconvenient, the FDA issued a very cursory rejection of the same $30 million state-of-the-art study that had never been done before. Subsequent to that study, and relevant to what the board is considering this evening, the Ramazzini Institute studied the equivalent of base station radiation, much weaker than cell phone radiation. And they found that even with base station radiation, there were particular types of highly rare, highly malignant tumors of the brain that occurred and of the nerve cells that were found in animals exposed to base station radiation as well. And those studies are relevant, and we can talk about their relevance to humans, but it's a preposterous hypocrisy on the part of the FDA to reject the study they originally requested that did find evidence of cancer.
Thank you for that. Representative Garth?
Yes, hi. Thank you, Rep. Matheny. Thank you for the presentation and the education on this subject. A lot of my questions have been answered. I have one for Judge Holzberg and Attorney Smith. Have any cities in the state not approved the template or the application?
If I may, I believe Judge Holzberg is left. This particular template is before 5 cities, including Stanford. As the judge said earlier, Hartford has approved it. Bridgeport has approved it. It is in the approval pipeline in New Haven and Waterbury. None of the cities that have acted on it have rejected it.
And do you know what changes or amendments were made from the template to the final application?
None.
None. Okay.
The template that is before you is in the form that was agreed to by all of the parties.
Okay. Thank you. I yield.
Thank you, Representative Garst. Representative Goldberg?
I just got a message that my battery's about to die. While I switch devices, could Representative Mays take my time?
Certainly. Representative Mays?
By the way, who's running the meeting? Because I'm going to have to drop off, get a new device, and come back.
I am Representative Goldberg. I'll admit you.
I'll
Thank you.
let you in.
Oh, okay. Sure.
Thank you, Representative Matheny. I assume I have the floor now.
Yes, sir.
First, I want to thank all of our panelists. Really appreciate the information that you presented tonight, as well as your perspective. You spent a lot of time with us, explaining a lot of the science. I'm a little concerned, though, that we have not heard perhaps what could be the other side of the story, and a different perspective. Knowing the fact that the FCC did set a standards, there must be people who have determined on how to set those standards and how to conduct the testing that would have that knowledge and perhaps knowledge of any kind of human health interactions. But absent that, I do have some questions for Mr. Chamberlain. We talked a little bit about the difference between base stations and small cells, and that the older technology required big base stations, and now we've got a lot of little small cells that may be distributed throughout our neighborhoods. Just check my knowledge on this, because I'm not sure I'm right, but my understanding is that the radiation in close proximity to the base stations is very high. And in comparison to the small cells, which in comparison is relatively low. Is that correct?
No, I wouldn't characterize it that way. There are a few distinctions that I think are important to make here. One is the naming of something being a small cell. In many places, and I've gone out and made measurements, something will be designated as a small cell based solely on its height. So as an example, you could have a 4G antenna placed on a 50-foot high mast, and they could call it a small cell, and it would get around certain zoning requirements. I've seen that firsthand. So I think we have to be careful as we parse this out. So what is a small cell? It could be 5G, it could be 4G. Like I say, I've seen it and measured it. So sometimes it's simply a means to get around zoning requirements to designate something as a small cell. So I'm not sure how to answer your question.
Interesting. I'd like to see how this contract is worded to actually articulate what exactly is a small cell.
Yeah.
Doesn't the radiation though dissipate as a exponential function of the distance from the unit?
It's 1/r squared for any frequency.
Right. So the people who live further away from a cell would be exposed to less radiation, correct?
Absolutely.
Significantly less radiation. Okay.
I got a little bit of a caveat there, and that is there's something called, well, the radiation pattern, the antenna pattern. So sometimes right under the site, you're going to have less radiation than as you move away from it. So if you were to plot radiation moving away from the site, the base of the tower, you'd see it be fairly low, and then it would increase with distance. So being different than the 1/r squared that I mentioned. Mm-hmm. So that's the antenna pattern, and that would be another discussion of that I'd be happy to get into. But that comes into play also.
That's an interesting caveat. One of the things that I think from a 30,000-foot view is that aren't we really exposed to RF radiation in our homes far more so today than even probably 10 years ago? I mean, when our homes are equipped with Wi-Fi routers, and sometimes repeaters, satellite systems, and those are, at least in my house, those are 5G. No. The radiation within your home, that's going to be 2.45 gigahertz and 5 gigahertz, but not 5G. Okay. So I guess that's it's a marketing term, as we probably talked about. But
also, it shows up as 5G on your phone, but it's not truly 5G. It's really very, very confusing. And there's no real regulation of this. And, again, it's wonderful that you're raising these points. Most people don't even get this far.
Right.
But if you want to know how to reduce your wireless in your home, we have a very valuable set of information on our website about how to reduce exposures. And we think it's appropriate to reduce exposures because we've shown you all the evidence on this. And the science, as Professor Chamberlain said, the science is pretty well established. The problem is it's a little bit like we're all in that pot of water that's getting hotter and hotter. And what we'd like to encourage, and what Environmental Health Trust is doing now, working with teachers and young parents and grandparents, is to encourage people to figure out ways to be wired. I mean, I'm talking to you now on a wired computer. I have a wired mouse. I am using an Ethernet connection. It's faster, safer, and more secure, and it can't be hacked as easily. And it's not that hard to do. And you'll find out, by the way, that you won't be saying, could you please get off because I'm trying to stream a movie? Because if everybody's wired, you won't be competing for bandwidth. So I think it's really important to say that you need to recognize that there are ways to reduce your exposures in your home, even though you're absolutely right. The exposures have grown exponentially.
Well, Ms. Davis, I think you're going to be really hard pressed to try to convince people to abandon wireless technology, to go back to wired technology. We're not going to go back to VCRs or fax machines either. So
no. I'm not
Not
saying
gonna
to abandon it. I'm saying that there are times when you don't need it. Obviously, mobile technology, I mean, I've got a mobile phone right here. By the way, it works fine in my house on airplane mode and Wi-Fi connected, and I turn it off and turn everything off at night. There are ways to do this to make it work.
So here's the question. You brought up mobile phones. So many people have their mobile phones against their ear for hours at a time. And in the overall scheme of things, isn't your exposure to RF radiation much higher from the radiation from your mobile phone, directly from your mobile phone to your brain, to your ear, than it would be from, let's say, a small cell that may be located 300 feet, 400 feet on a cell tower in your neighborhood? A small cell.
Yes.
That's correct.
Theodore,
Are you saying somebody specific, or is it just Representative Mays?
Well, I was actually directing my questions to Mr. Chamberlain, but if Ms. Davis wants to answer those, that's fine.
No, Mr. Chamberlain, please.
okay. So you're absolutely right. This is going to be a far greater radiation than what you get from a cell tower near you, more acute. But you're going to get the cell phone radio or the cell tower radiation 24/7. These towers, they don't put them up in areas with no traffic density. So you're going to, the cell tower is operating almost continuously, sending out radiation. I would hope that you're not on your cell phone 24/7, but your point is well taken. But here's something that the New Hampshire Commission was very adamant about, and that is we would like you, the citizen, to be able to make the decision about your exposure. So if a cell tower is far away, you can turn off the electronics in your home and not be exposed. If you want to use Wi-Fi, if you want to use all the resources available for wireless radiation, you can do that also. We felt it was very important to give you the choice because some people are so sensitive to exposure to radiation. As I mentioned earlier, they can't be in a room with an operating cell phone. So we want people
understood.
To be
so
able
it really
to,
comes down to your risk tolerance.
Yes.
As to whether you want to take that risk or not, I suppose, once you know what the potential hazards are. But
Right.
But if we go down that road a little bit, let me ask you a question. How would you reconcile the difference between the risk of potential health effects from exposure to RF radiation through your home, through the cells, small cells, whatever, and the inability to make an emergency phone call if somebody's being attacked because their cell service is so poor? And we've got Representative Matheny, who's actually suffering from that problem right now. Not that you're being attacked, and thank God you've got an ex-policeman.
The answer, I don't know if you're aware of Wi-Fi calling. That's what my phone's set to right now. So I do have Wi-Fi at home. It's pretty low level, but I do have it. I can get access to my Wi-Fi anywhere in the home. And as long as my phone is set to Wi-Fi calling, I have really great connection. And it operates exactly as you'd want a cell phone when connected to the cellular network. I'm getting about 30 times lower radiation connecting to my own Wi-Fi than I would if I connected to the cellular network.
Well, what about if people are out and about in their neighborhood and they're not connected to Wi-Fi?
Well, I think in what I mentioned before too about the signal level you need to have a great connection. It is 1/1,000,000th of the FCC limit. So you can be enjoying a great phone call, 4 bars, 5 bars, and be not be in the range of exposures that's going to be harmful.
Okay.
In fact, I've got a slide that shows that, but I don't need to go to it right now. So it's just where
Well,
you place the tower, and that's what I've spent my career doing is siting of cell towers, of radio towers, and I know that you can do that. You move far away enough away so that you're not overly exposing people.
So you talked before about the standards that have been set by the FCC, the lack of, let's say, robust testing to really get an clear understanding of the health effects. I'm not sure if these studies that were done by the FCC were peer reviewed or not, but I certainly would have hoped so. But is there any way that you can advocate for, as a group, perhaps advocate for better standards from the FCC, and make a compelling enough argument that the government would actually go and do a review and make a determination that the standards need to be tightened?
So a direct answer to your question is that I'm vice chair of a group. It's the International Commission on the Biological Effects of Electromagnetic Radiation. And we've written a 14-point paper that addresses exactly what's wrong with the FCC standards. So that's been published. I can make it available to you. And
sure.
The thing is, when you're dealing with captured agency, and I don't mean to sound like a conspiracy theorist, this is real. Harvard University identified it. But when you have a captured agency, they can look, you can send them all the data you want, and they just kind of shrug their shoulders. They're not going to do anything. So yeah, we're doing our part. A lot of us are trying to do our part. Environmental Health Trust is doing their part. But when you're dealing with a captured agency, they can ignore you as long as they want, just like the tobacco industry did. And that's what that Harvard University report says. It says that telecom, the FCC is following the same playbook as did big tobacco. And if you keep repeating a lie often enough, it becomes the truth. And I'm afraid that's what we're seeing.
Well, I guess I'm not as skeptical as you. I'm not as skeptical as you because I deal with the Consumer Product Safety Commission on a regular basis, and I've got them to change many laws based on my advocacy efforts. So
could you join us?
I would encourage you, if you truly believe that the science behind your studies is solid, that you try to make that change and advocate for that change. But in the meantime, we're faced with the existing technology that's in the marketplace. And I think that until that technology changes in the marketplace, we are essentially going to have to accept it. I think otherwise, as other municipalities have found, that if they try to go against the FCC rules, or the carriers are going to sue them, and I don't think we want to subject the city to that.
Well, but first of all, even if they sue you, the only thing they can get out of it is that you accept their permit, that you approve their permit. They can't sue you for damages. So I'm hopeful that more municipalities are active in this. And by the way, there are quite a few municipalities that have put in setbacks. In fact, Theodore Scarrato talked about that. So a lot of places have done that. They've put into place meaningful setbacks for schools and daycare centers and hospitals. So it can be done.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. I really appreciate your answers tonight. Appreciate the information you presented. So thank you, and I yield the floor.
Thank you for giving us the opportunity.